An 89-year-old farmer named Craig Morrison stands in a courtroom, dressed in his best clothes, facing a judge who tells him he is in contempt of court. The building commission has documented 26 violations against the structure Craig has been raising with his own hands. The government is asking that it be bulldozed before he can finish it. A court order has also been placed against him, forbidding any further building on the site. The judge asks him plainly whether he understands that he could go to jail. Craig says that he does understand, and he answers the question quietly, without anger. He answers the way a man answers when he has already decided that the cause was worth the cost. To understand why he is standing there, you have to go back to the farm and to the woman who made every decision he has ever taken feel like the right one. Craig and his wife, Irene Morrison, ride together through the countryside in their red truck, talking about death the way people do when they have lived long enough to be honest about it. Irene says that when she was young, she looked at old people and believed that if you lived long enough, you probably had time to figure out dying. She says she is no closer now to the great mystery than she was at 10. They stand together in a church at a friend's funeral, and Craig places his hand over Irene's hand on the back of the pew. The gesture is so quiet and habitual that it speaks more plainly than anything either of them says aloud. Back at the farmhouse, they move through the rhythms of a life built across many decades, tending raised beds, collecting eggs, and hauling timber. Craig jokes with Irene about their eldest daughter's opinion of the garden, while Irene tends her plants without looking up. When Irene sits in the truck and cannot remember that the cows blocking the road are their own, Craig answers her gently, without correction in his voice. The fear of what is happening to her memory is something he is not yet prepared to name out loud. In the barn, Craig's daughter Ruth asks whether the doctor said anything about Irene's memory at the checkup. Craig says he forgot to ask, and then adds quietly that maybe he should be asking about his own memory. It is his way of deflecting something he is not ready to face directly. Irene is visible through the truck window, asleep against the doorframe. The sight of her there, worn out and unaware, carries the weight of everything Craig has not said. One evening, Irene comes into the kitchen and asks what Craig has done to it. When he tells her she left an oven mitt on the stove, she insists she did not. Her expression moves from certainty to confusion in the space of a few seconds. Craig goes out alone and stands in a wide field under a gray sky. When his son, John, comes out to join him, the conversation between them is careful and indirect. It is the kind of conversation men have when the thing they most need to say is the thing they are least able to say. By winter, Craig sits across from Irene at the kitchen table and tells her they have already burned through 3 cords of wood, barely keeping the old farmhouse warm. He tells her plainly that the place may not be much longer before it does not work for them anymore. Irene says she is not moving into town and that he will have to shoot her before she ends up in a retirement home. Craig listens and then tells her he was not thinking of any of that. He was thinking only of building something smaller and more manageable on their own plot across the road, one level, something safe. He tells her he would do the work himself, that with the strawberries and the cattle both gone, he has a great deal more free time. If he did it that way, he tells her, they could afford it without taking a mortgage. Irene asks only one thing of him, that they will not move until they have to, and Craig agrees. The two of them sit at the table, and the agreement between them is plain and equal and unsentimentally tender. It is the way things are between people who have needed each other for a very long time. Craig tells his daughter Ruth that he was not certain when he started whether he still had it in him, and his tone carries the satisfaction of a man who has answered that question for himself. He adds that none of the urgency belongs to him, but to her mother, and that word, mother, makes plain what is driving every nail he drives. Then the stop work order appears, a red notice tacked to the wooden frame of the house Craig has been raising with his own hands. He pulls it free and stands holding it, and the look on his face is not anger so much as the exhaustion of a man who already has more to carry than most men his age should have to carry. Rick Daigle, the government building inspector, arrives and makes clear that the stop work order Craig ignored was a legally binding document. Craig explains that his grandson, who was drawing up the plans, had been buried by a breakdown at the refinery, and even as he says it, he knows the explanation will not be enough. Craig sits before a man his lawyer Gary Fulton later represents him before, and the man tells him plainly to stop building, get the plans approved, and let the whole thing blow over. Craig listens with his hands in his lap, and then says he still feels he is being asked to pay for other people's mistakes, and the grievance in those words is not about $300. Soon afterward, Irene is alone in the farmhouse in the dark, calling Craig's name, and there is fear in her voice that rises steadily as she receives no answer. Craig comes in from the workshop and finds her frightened, and when she asks how she could possibly have forgotten where he had gone, the question carries the grief of a woman who is watching her own mind become unreliable. He pulls her into his arms, and the hug between them is not the comfort of people who are fine, but of people holding on to one another because the alternative is unthinkable. When Daigle returns with a list of violations, Craig walks him through the frame and tells him the joists were built the way his father taught him, a shipwright out of St. Martin's, one of the largest shipbuilding centers on the eastern seaboard. Daigle cuts him off and says there is zero leeway and that Craig must deal with the violations or the permit will be pulled and the house bulldozed. Craig stands alone inside the frame after Daigle leaves, and the defeat visible in the way he holds himself is the defeat of a man who has been told that his knowledge, his skill, his father's craft, and his entire reason for building count for nothing against a set of stamps on wood. Later, Craig arrives home to find Irene on the floor, and he kneels beside her and takes her hand, and the tenderness with which he touches her is inseparable from the terror behind it. At the hospital, he tells her quietly that he is worried their luck is beginning to run out, and those words are the closest he has come to saying plainly what he has been carrying since before the first board went up. Back at the farmhouse, Craig installs a safety gate and tapes signs to the walls telling Irene where things are, and he is marking a home with reminders because the woman he has lived in it with for decades can no longer trust her own memory. When Ruth tells him a house is not going to fix what is happening to Irene, he acknowledges that freely and says it will make everything more manageable. When she suggests Irene may not know what she wants anymore, he says yes, she does, in a tone that is quiet and final and permits no argument. Late at night, lying in the bed they have moved to the living room, Craig looks at Irene in the dark with tears filling his eyes, and when she asks what will happen if she forgets everything, he tells her she will still be his Irene. Driving home one evening, Irene looks out the truck window at the house frame across the road and tells Craig that someone is building a new house there and that they have picked a beautiful spot. He smiles slightly and does not tell her it is the house he is building for her. Craig looks down at Irene sleeping against his shoulder. He is a man running out of time, fighting a government, failing his own body, and building a house so that the woman asleep on his shoulder will have somewhere safer to forget. Craig lifts Irene into his arms when she becomes distressed outside, and she fights him, telling him to let her go. He carries her toward the house anyway, because he has no other choice. He sets her down on the bed and sits on the edge beside her. The silence between them holds everything he cannot say about how frightened he is and how little control he has over what is happening to her. He tells her he is sorry, repeating it 6 times without stopping. Each repetition is not an apology for a single act, but for all the ways the situation has outgrown what he is able to fix. At the hospital, Craig tells his son that he was angry with Irene before she fell, that they had fought because she wanted to sleep out on the front lawn, and he would not allow it. He says he dragged her into the house. When his son tries to tell him he had no choice, Craig cuts him off and says, "Not like that," meaning that the manner of what he did is something he will not excuse or let anyone excuse for him. Sitting beside her hospital bed, Craig tells Irene that her husband is a fool. He means it without self-pity, as a plain statement of guilt from a man who holds himself responsible for her broken hip. The doctor tells Craig that given Irene's physical and mental condition, she will need follow-up therapy and home care, and that he does not foresee a time when it would stop altogether. Craig tells the doctor that he and Irene have been together 61 years and have never spent more than a handful of nights apart. Then he says that if that is the way it has to be, then that is the way it is. The resignation in those words is the resignation of a man who has learned that endurance is the only thing left available to him. When Craig goes to the building department and asks them to tell him what to do so that he can do it, the clerk tells him that the office does not have the resources to teach people the fundamentals of how to build. The clerk says they either know how or they hire someone who does. Craig looks down and walks away. The humiliation of being told he does not know how to build by a clerk after a lifetime of building is not a thing he answers. A police officer serves Craig with court papers while he is tending to his chickens. Craig sits alone at his kitchen table afterward, reading the documents with a pained expression. The table beneath his hands is the one he milled himself and finished with 12 coats, the table that holds the scratches and marks of 61 years of family life. He sits at it now, facing the possibility of jail. Craig tells his lawyer, Gary Fulton, that Irene has broken her hip and that she will have to get around with a walker. He says their old house does not work anymore. Those 2 sentences contain the entire reason he kept building after every stop-work order, stated plainly and without appeal. Craig tells Gary he does not seem to have much of an appetite these days. It is not the complaint of a sick man, but the admission of a man for whom the ordinary needs of living have become an interruption. When John tells him to take the night off, Craig says she is expecting him. He leaves for the hospital because the one obligation that is not diminished is the one to Irene. Sitting alone on his bed at night, Craig tells Irene over the phone that he has missed her, and she tells him she misses him too. Then she begins to cry. When he asks how she is doing, she says she has been better, and he says he has too. That small exchange between 2 people who have been together 61 years and are now separated by a hospital corridor carries more grief than anything either of them has said aloud throughout the entire film. Standing before the judge in court, Craig talks about baseball and the religion of rules. He says that he does not mean to put himself above the law and that he never has. Then he pauses and says until now. He tells the court that Irene is due home the following week, that their options are limited, and that they will move into the house. He says that either he is going to jail or he is going home, and that either way he can sleep with a clear conscience. When Craig walks up his new porch steps and reads a newspaper headline that says, "No jail for Morrison," he begins to smile. It is the first time in the film that his face carries something close to relief without any grief underneath it. Back inside, Irene stands behind Craig as he sits looking downcast, and she places her hand on his shoulder and begins to run her fingers through his hair. She asks how long since his last haircut, then puts a yellow cape around his shoulders and picks up her scissors. She kisses his forehead, and he asks if she is cutting his hair, and she says of course she is, and asks again how long it has been. She has already forgotten that she asked, but she is still there, still his Irene, still standing behind him with her hands in his hair. That is the thing